Hello, welcome to Money Matters on TV 360. I am Adeshawa Odushoga. The Forum of China and Africa Cooperation is a visible economic cooperation between China and African countries, particularly Nigeria. Launched in 2000 and held every 3 years, FOCAC is the vehicle that drives Chinese foreign policy in Africa and the fulcrum of its investment and lending on the continent. This year's FOCAC summit in Beijing attracted leaders from across Africa, where they met with their Chinese counterparts to assess the achievements of the last FOCAC, which held in South Africa, and discuss and further improving cooperation between China and Africa. During the 2-day summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony announced that China will extend a total of $60 billion of financing to Africa. The financing will be provided in the form of government assistance as well as investment and financing by financial institutions and companies. The financing includes $15 billion of grants, interest-free loans and concessional loans, $20 billion of credit lines, the setting up of a $10 billion special fund for development financing, and a $5 billion special fund for financing imports from Africa. Chinese companies are also encouraged to make at least $10 billion of investment in Africa in the next 3 years. Xi, in a speech, also said the country follows a 5-no approach in its relations with Africa, which includes no interference in African countries' pursuit of development paths that fit their national conditions, no interference in African countries' internal affairs, no imposition of China's will on African countries, no attachment of political strings to assistance to Africa, and lastly, no seeking of selfish political gains in investment and financing cooperation with Africa. The Chinese president further said his country will implement 8 major initiatives with African countries in the next 3 years and beyond, covering fields on industrial promotion, infrastructural connectivity, trade facilitation, green development, capacity building, healthcare, people-to-people exchanges, peace, and security. Another important part of the Chinese president's speech is that China will write off the debts of poor African countries whose debts were due for repayment this year. Now, ahead of the FOCAC summit, we saw Germany and Britain make renewed foray into the continent. The British Prime Minister Theresa May visited Nigeria on Wednesday, 29th of August 2018. Making her first landing in Abuja, the federal capital, where she met with President Muhammadu Buhari. She explained that the reason for her visit is to bring jobs and enhance trade links between Nigeria and Britain. She had also visited South Africa and Kenya during her trip. 2 days after Theresa May's visit, German Chancellor Angela Merkel was also in Nigeria, wrapping up a 3-day Africa visit in Nigeria with a meeting between the leaders of Europe and Africa's largest economies, focusing on migration. Merkel had visited Senegal and Ghana with a focus on strengthening economic development and containing irregular migration. I have been speaking with these 2 experts, Gabriel Idahose and Johnson Chukwu, to get their opinion on what this deal means for Africa. The 2018 FOCAC summit has just ended, and the Chinese President Xi Jinping gave some speech at the opening. What are the key takeaways for you?
I think his speech expresses the long-term established Chinese attitude and objectives for engagement with Africa. The Chinese see themselves first and foremost as an emerging economy, a developing economy. and they have had the experience that most African countries have had, trying to grow out of poverty and building a modern economy. They have succeeded in doing that to a large extent. So they have that experience of growing an economy, and they want to share that experience with most countries in Africa who are at various stages of going through that transition. So that is essentially how Chinese foreign engagement with Africa is fashioned. It's built about sharing experience that they have gone through themselves. And they believe that if they can share that experience with Africa and invest some of the gains of their growth in Africa, they will enable Africa to rise economically as they have done. And essentially, they are able to do that because they have aspirations that align with our own aspirations. They have aspirations to grow their own economy for 1.2 billion people. There are still large populations of China that are still poor, that are classified by all international indices, are still below the poverty line. So they also want to grow their export economy. And the way to do that is to look at countries like Latin America and Africa that are just growing, that have very large long-term growth prospects. The population of Africa and Latin America are quite young. So there's still a long way ahead for these two continents to grow. And so any investment they make now is for the long-term benefit of both parties. They enable Africa to grow their economies. They enable the young population of Africa to get the development they need through education, through infrastructure. And by the time our young population begins to mature, the economy will also have matured. We will become a strong market for Chinese economy as well. So they have taken a long-term view that here is a continent that is just growing. As the economy grows, their consuming power, their purchasing power will grow. The middle class in most African countries are growing. So anyone who establishes a long-term relationship with us is guaranteed that market.
I think for me it shows that the Chinese leadership has remained consistent in their support to African countries. This is the third FUCAT meeting, and obviously the last meeting, which was held 3 years ago in Johannesburg, the president of China also promised a $60 billion support for African economies. So cumulatively, we have seen we're going to see about $120 billion of support to African economies in terms of infrastructure, in terms of government assistance, in terms of loans, and also in terms of funding of trade between the two countries. I think, for me, that is further reflection of the way the Chinese government sees African economy, African countries. Obviously, they are looking for trading partners. They're also looking for partners who can also grow in terms of wealth. And the Chinese government has remained consistent in supporting wealth creation and wealth development and expansion of economic infrastructure in African economies.
President Xi also announced a $60 billion financing to Africa for the next 3 years. This is the same he gave in the last 3 years. How significant is this fund for Africa?
It is quite material, given the fact that no other global economic power is supporting Africa to that extent. And again, if you look at the sectors that the president said, apart from $5 billion, which would be a kind of to finance support for import from Africa, about $20 billion is going to go, $15 billion is going to go into infrastructure development, and another $20 billion will go into trade facilitation. So if you look at the distribution of those funds, you will actually see, like I mentioned earlier, that the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership has focused a lot of resources to support African economies to expand their consumption capacity, to support infrastructure development. We've seen a lot of investment by the Chinese in infrastructure in Africa, across Africa. And this is a further confirmation of the way the Chinese leadership views their partnership with African economies, to the extent that they want to support African economies to grow and expand.
Well, it's quite significant. And prior to the visit, I had looked at the last meeting in 2015 and the level of commitment, which was about the same 60 billion. So against that background, I was expecting China to increase that commitment, essentially because the number of African countries that have expanded their business and trade and engagement in China has grown. Also, each of those countries in Africa are also growing. So the number of countries involved are growing from Africa. Each of the economies in Africa are growing. Their infrastructure needs are growing. Their aspirations, their outlook for the future is growing. So one will expect that a country like China will do a lot more. But 60 billion is a very significant amount. It's also important that they are beginning to look at the actual benefits of all those investments. Previously, that conversation as to the specific long-term benefits of those investments were not discussed. China was initially primarily interested in building an engagement, having a line of communication, of access into each African country. Having achieved that, they now want to see the value of their investment to the people of the country. So it's not just about infrastructure for infrastructure's sake, but how is that infrastructure impacting on the lives of the people, with the quality of life, the human development aspects of the benefits of that infrastructure, because you can have growth without development. And in most cases, a lot of countries in Africa have done that. They have achieved economic growth by way of GDP increase year on year, but there has been no development in the sense that the number of people who still live in poverty in a lot of these countries is either growing or where they were. So a lot of the growth is in the hands of very few large corporations. So you have non-inclusive growth. So China is now saying that we will continue to engage. They still want to repeat the 60 billion, but they want to see inclusive growth. They want to see this investment trickle down to all layers of the people, rather than the large corporations at the top of the economy.
The Chinese president also said that some African countries will have their outstanding debt cancelled. For me, this is like a lot of advantage for Africa. How much importance do you think this is for the continent?
Yes, some of these countries deserve cancellation of the debts because of historical factors. There are countries that have gone through periods of war and strife, countries like South Sudan, Somalia, Liberia, Sierra Leone. And if they are able to get those debts cancelled, then they can now start on a fresh start, a fresh slate where they can develop mutually beneficial relationships. They can offer to China investment opportunities that China can benefit from, and they can, on the platform of those new investments, develop their own economy. So they can make their economy attractive to China as a viable economy if those debts are put aside, and they can offer new investments that have potential for growing the economy. Because in the medium and long term, China needs these countries that are vibrant, that have a growing middle class, that will form a new base of consumption for products and services from China. So that is a very important factor for China, that these countries will grow out of poverty, develop a strong middle class, and be able to join the global middle class consumption of products and services that countries like China and other industrialized societies produce, and for which they look for customers around the world. So essentially, you are looking at a relationship that is mutually beneficial. But China has the foresight to do long-term investments for those benefits to mature before they start to gain the reward of their investments. These infrastructure projects will allow these countries in Africa to mature. Their economies will become more efficient if they have more power, more roads, more airports, more seaports, a strong educational system, and the economy becomes essentially an emerging market economy, no more an underdeveloped economy. Then China will have a very large market in two continents that they have secured over the time because of building these very strong relationships. I don't think China has hidden their intentions. I don't think the motives are so obscure has to be regarded as ulterior. China's objectives have always been very clear. They have had the experience of growing a very backward, underdeveloped economy to what the rest of the world now regards as an advanced economy. To sustain that and to solve their own internal economic issues of a very large population that is still poor, they need to export continuously. They need to grow their exports. For them to grow their exports, they need countries that have strong consumer capacity to take their products. So the first objective of China is to grow economies that can be big enough to consume their products and services. And they have not made any secret about it. They have said they want to grow economies in partnership with Africa so that these countries can become better trading partners. That is the way it is expressed. But a better trading partner is a partner that is able to buy more products and services from you, in this case from China, in the future, because their purchasing power has been enhanced through the investments of China and other countries. So they have not really made any hidden objective. The point is that other countries that are being displaced by China from their preeminent positions in these countries are, of course, not happy that their dominant positions in these countries are being gradually replaced by other countries led by China. Not only China, but led by China. They have seen their dominant positions in most sectors of African economies gone down. They are either now number 5, number 6, or much down the line in most of the sectors in African economies. China and some other countries from Asia has gone to number 1, number 2, sometimes number 3 and 4. And of course, they cannot be amused by this situation. And so they continue to spread this information or this opinion that China is trying to pursue an ulterior motive. But their motive is transparent in the sense that they are investing in their future welfare by developing African and Latin American economies, who will be their future customers for their products. And I don't think they have made any mystery about this.
Well, I think if you look at the history of Chinese support in Africa, in the past, between 2000 and 2018, the Chinese government has written off or cancelled about 10 billion debt owed by African countries that are very poor. And this additional promise is that they will further grant some debt cancellation to poor African countries will go a long way to relieve those countries of the burden of debt service and debt obligations. And but they are also on the side of the African economy. They need to also look at what is sustainable debt they can borrow. It is not good for African economies to enjoy debt relief, and the next day they go back into borrowing binge and then accumulate a lot of debt. But the most important thing for me is that the Chinese leadership has remained consistent. Like I said earlier, we've seen a $10 billion dollar waiver in the past 17, 18 years by the Chinese government for 4 very poor African countries. And then there's additional promise. Similarly, just like we mentioned earlier, we saw a $60 billion 3 years offer in 2015 that was made at the Johannesburg meeting, and we have another $60 billion. So that's, for me, that shows consistency. But in terms of debt forgiveness, I think, like I said earlier, the African economy managers, African leadership should also be very circumspect in accumulating additional debt. Immediately after the Second World War, the US government and European countries came together to support the rebuilding of Germany. They needed to do that so that Germany would resume their position as a major trading partner. What China is doing is to support the expansion of consumption in Africa, so that Africa will remain a strong trading partner for China. I do not imagine that to be a great gift. The basic thing is that if economies in Africa expand, if per capita income increase, then African economies, African consumers will actually also expand their consumption capacity. And China is looking for an export market. So China is looking for trading partners. And that's why the theme for this year's conference between China and African countries. It was also included a win-win arrangement. The fact that when your trading partner is in a strong financial position, you're in a better position to export your goods.
More partnerships coming in for Nigeria and Africa at large, and we hope this turns out good, particularly strengthening the Nigerian economy. On this note, we've come to the end of this edition. To watch us again, it's simple. Just visit our website at www.tv360nigeria.com. You can also watch us across all our social media platforms at TV360 Nigeria. Thank you very much for watching. I am Adeshawa Odushoga.